Stop recording. Okay, here we go. And let me just check one more time to see if Yvette has joined us tonight. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jenny McCabe. I'm the Executive Director of the NSNC, and we are very happy to have all of you with us tonight, as well as our accomplished guests. I will give a brief introduction to each person, and then as we talk, they'll tell you a little bit more about their roles and some of their accomplishments in journalism. I know Kevin, for one, has recently, I'll start with Kevin, and I also want to acknowledge our president, Meredith Cummings. She's here tonight in the crowd. So thanks to everyone for being here and be a part of this discussion. Kevin Smith is a fellow Ohioan. We've known each other for many years through the journalism world and journalism organizations. Kevin is the director of the Kiplinger program, and he wanted to be a journalist from a young age. He was a teenager when he decided to be a journalist. He's been involved in journalism for more than 40 years in the classroom, in the newsroom. And he was telling, for those of you who were on, he was telling an elevator story. And most recently, he's been traveling abroad, sharing his journalism background with others around the globe. So I'm sure we'll hear a few of his exciting stories as well. He was recently in an elevator that dropped, so I'm sure that was quite scary and interesting to be in that experience. But we're very excited to have you with us, Kevin. And then I will go to Matthew Hall. He's McClatchy, South Carolina opinion editor, and he's been a journalist for more than 30 years. Like Kevin, he's a former president of the National Society of Newspaper Columnists, and he's also the current vice president of the organization. All of these panelists are strong leaders in the field and award-winning as well. And that brings me to John Diaz. John, he has worked with the San Francisco Chronicle for many decades until he retired in 2021. Again, he received multiple honors, and we are excited to hear from him tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into our discussion. I think we got a lot of good things to cover. But before I do that, I just want Kevin to say a word about the Kiplinger program and some of the maybe things they're doing. I know they will probably kick off a new program this fall, and it's a great program. I think all of us, I'm not sure about John, but I know Matthew and I have been Kiplinger fellows, and so it's a very great program to be involved with. It's sort of an elite select program, so maybe for those on the call, you might want to consider applying for a fellowship. It does attract journalists from across the globe. And Kevin, I'll just let you take it away on that note.
Okay, thank you. It's my pleasure to have Kiplinger sponsor tonight's event for all of you and your organization. Yes, all three, John, Matt, and Jenny, are all Kiplinger fellows at one time, and we were delighted to have them and include them in our long list of alumni. The Kiplinger program in public affairs journalism has been around now for 53 years. We started at Ohio State University, and we are now at Ohio University. We've been there now 6 of those 53 years. Our fellowship is held each spring, and since 2023, it focuses on what we call critical reporting issues. So our very first fellowship under that new reconstructed program was to talk about climate change. What we did was we wanted to make sure that reporters had the necessary tools and understanding about how to better cover climate change. Then we went to immigration migration, which we thought was, and has turned out to be, a key issue in the United States, even more so now than maybe 3 years ago. Last year, I should say earlier this year, we did artificial intelligence. But what I want to, I guess, promote here is in April, at the end of April in 2026, we are going to focus on the topic of saving community news. And what we hope to do is to focus primarily on American United States news deserts, but we will likely have some people internationally, but our focus is really on how to have what we need to do as a news organizations, as news individuals, as individual news outlets to do better to try to preserve news coverage in the communities. And so this should be an extremely important topic and one I think that we'll get a lot of interest in. So I would say that look for our Kiplinger program. Just type in Kiplinger program, Ohio University, and you'll find our website and look for the details there. Applications start in October and end in November. And I hope that is of interest to a number of you who would be interested in figuring out how we can slow the progression of deterioration of community news in our country. So thanks for the opportunity to host us, and thanks for the opportunity to give a plug in about the Kiplinger. I'm looking forward to, as a former editorial writer a long time ago, I'm really looking forward to hearing what John and Matt and others have to say. So I'm taking copious notes as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. And as Matt put in the chat, he is the former national SPJ president and the current SPJ Foundation president. I'm sorry if I messed that up, Matthew.
All good, all good, all good.
So, our first question, I really would like, John, I'll start with you. Why do you feel like opinion writing is a little bit different? Why is it important? And, why does it matter to readers?
Well, here's why it's a really good question, Jenny, because and one that I've thought about during my 25 years as editorial page editor is, and I think what opinion writing versus news, the news side offers is a way for readers to think about issues. Now, you're not telling them necessarily what to think, but here's a way to think about issues. The other thing that I think is so important is, there's so much news coming at people, just a deluge, tweet after tweet, or so much information is out there that I think, especially on issues that are complicated or sometimes confusing, gives readers a chance to kind of clarify. I always thought part of my role as a opinion writer was explanatory, to explain, okay, what is the essence of this issue? So I think it really provides a service. And I think even more so now that there are so many voices, so many hot takes, that as journalists, we can be accountable, and we can kind of, let people if we make mistakes, we account for it. If we have a bad take, the next week we can change our mind.
Thanks, John. Matt, as an opinion editor, what do you see? I'm sure you get all kinds of people are writing in, just hearing from people. What are you seeing in that regard? And then how do you filter that into what makes it to the paper?
Great questions. Yeah, I mean, I think to kind of pivot off what John was saying, he kind of hit the nail on the head, which is we need, I think of opinion journalism as a lighthouse, right? Like, and journalism as a boat. And we're got the rocks of misinformation we're all going to hit, right? Like, and so we're trying to steer away from that. And there's just so much information, which is the water we're navigating. As you might imagine, I'm sure John was the same, responses from people who read either the columns that I write or the guest essays that I publish. And they love them or they hate them. And what I tell them is my columns, my opinion section isn't trying to end conversation, it's trying to foster it, right? And so to John's point, if you the opinion that you come to believe later is incorrect, you can change it. You can also have a conversation offline, so to speak, with readers and let them know that's another way to think of this. Thank you for writing me, even if they disagree. The emails I love the most aren't the ones that I'd put on my fridge, if we still did that. they're the ones that totally disagree with me. I got an email, I printed it out here because I wanted to read it to y'all. Just this week, I wrote a column on South Carolina County, which is one of the many in this country that's joining forces with the federal government to combat illegal immigration. Very controversial issue. Some places love it at a local level. Others are scared that it means some things that are dangerous for Latino communities particularly. And so I got this letter from a reader. My first question to you is, why are you so ignorant about illegal immigration? And your statement that Latinos are the main culprits, et cetera, et cetera. And so I sent them back a quote and a link to a Pew study that actually said of the 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country, 8 million are from Mexico or Latin America, right? So to your question directly, Jenny, how you get at this and you decide what to publish, it's what's based in fact, right? Those are the conversations that I want in my opinion section and in other opinion sections. Opinions are great. Everyone has them. The best opinions are rooted in fact, and then we can disagree on those facts.
Matt, you said that so well, because I always thought, I was a journalist for the better part of 4 decades, and every mistake, even the smallest one, is very painful. But I felt in some ways even more of a responsibility, if that's possible, when I was an editorial writer and columnist, that if you're pounding the table saying this is the way it should be, and you make a mistake, it's so costly to your credibility that I think it's really important that facts are every bit as important, if not more so, in opinion writing than in news coverage.
Thank you. And Kevin, you're welcome to chime in if you have something to add to any of these questions as well.
No, I mean, I worked at I was a managing editor of a small daily, about 25,000 circulation, and was part of an editorial writing team and then wrote a column. But what Matt and John have said is exactly right. I never wrote an editorial where I didn't make sure that it was factually solid. In fact, it would not be unusual for me to pull the reporter who actually wrote the story into the office and say, okay, I want to write an editorial about this. And this is what I'm thinking of saying, but I want to make sure, check with them and get their perspective. Because if you're writing about city council or a county commission, they're there every single solitary week. I come back, or they come back, and I read their story and I edit their story. But for them to have their finger on the pulse of what's actually going on is important for me as an editorial writer to tap into that before I go making editorial decisions about where the paper's going to stand on some issue. So they're absolutely right. Fact checking your editorials is primary responsibility. I find that facts are just as equal as opinion in those columns or in those editorials.
Thanks so much. We've touched on the fact that really opinion writing and op-eds are really a lot of, as Matt said, they're based on current events, news, things that are on the public's mind. But what are some of the other elements of strong opinion writing? Matt, I'll start with you on this one. In other words, is it, what sparks these letters to the editor? What, I guess, drives opinion columns?
Yeah. Also a good question. I tell folks all the time that the two things that separate a really good essay from a potentially bad or a really bad essay are experience and expertise, right? So that's what makes a strong essay. Someone who knows what they're talking about and more often than not has lived what they're talking about. That's what separates, an essay of any length. Typically newspapers, it's 600, 700, 800 words, from a much shorter letter to the editor or an even shorter tweet or Facebook post. Some of Kevin's Facebook posts are actually really long, so maybe it's too long. But that's what makes a great essay, I think, in a very short explanation, is expertise and experience. Tying into that is explanation. And John hit on this too. Again, that kind of gets at that someone knows what they're talking about, that they can explain it, whether you're writing about something complicated like pension reform or Gaza. It's the people who know it best who have something to say. And I will just make another point. For my opinion section here in South Carolina, I get essays all the time from people who want to lobby Congress, or write international news about Gaza, for example. And I unfortunately tell them that I don't have the bandwidth or the space or the time to publish everything I get. So I need to make difficult decisions about what will surface on our websites and in our newspapers. And those decisions, I base those decisions on a simple foundation. Is it local? Is it of interest to South Carolinians? You can publish stuff on Gaza in the Washington Post and the New York Times and a whole slew of other national publications, and you can publish anything you want on social media. But in South Carolina, you should be reading in our papers, and you will be reading on our papers and websites, stuff that's of interest to South Carolina. And so that's kind of a long-winded way of answering your question, but I think those are my key points. What do you think, John?
Well, here's a couple things that I think about when I think what makes a really strong either column or editorial. First of all, this is what I not only tell the writers who work for me, but also when I guest lecture at a college. First of all, no surprise endings. If you've got a really strong piece, you don't want to just be weaving back and forth, and then at the end, oh gee, or on balance, this is what we think. I think you want to be clear from the start. When I first got my job as editorial page editor, never worked on an editorial page for a day in my life, and I went in as editor, and the executive editor at the time who hired me said, "There's only one thing I never want to see in one of your editorials," and I go, "Gulp." Does he have some friend who's a member of Congress, or is there some issue that he feels really strongly about? He said, "I never want to see the phrase 'on the other hand.'" He goes, "You want to take a position, you want to clarify the position, support the position." But one other caveat I would put to that is that when you have when you're writing an editorial, know what the other side's strongest point is, and know that you need to account for it in some way in that piece. Because what happens if somebody's reading your opinion piece and they know the other side's strongest point and you never mention it? They would think, well, if Diaz had only done his homework and knew X, then he might have come to a different conclusion. So that would be, no surprise endings, but at the same time, you do want to be fair in treating the other side's strongest argument and know what it is.
Thank you both. We have a question from one of our longtime members, Bill Timaeus. And Bill, I've give you permission to talk if you wanted to ask your question.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. I'm wondering what your media outlets do to educate the public to be discerning readers who know, for instance, the difference between an unsigned editorial in a byline column or an analysis piece versus something else. And does whatever you do in that regard work? I asked this out of having been a member of a group in Kansas City years ago that tried to educate young people to be wise and discerning consumers of media. And it worked for a while, but then that group went away. So I'm curious about that. Anybody who wants to take that.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'm sure John has things to say too, but I don't think journalists understand the difference between certain types of journalism. So asking the public to understand is near impossible. Which is not to say I don't go out of my way to explain to folks the difference between an unsigned editorial, a column, a letter to the editor, an essay, an op-ed. No one knows what an op-ed stands for. It stands for opposite the editorial page. There isn't editorial pages anymore because people get their news online or from social media outlets. So I've stopped using the term op-ed, and I'm a opinion team of one. And so I made the decision when I took this job that I didn't want to write unsigned editorials. I wanted to write columns that were people's names were attached, because I think readers can understand that, right? I worked in San Diego for almost 25 years, and the last 8 of those, I was head of the opinion section there, and we had an 8-person team. And so we did have unsigned editorials, and I thought that there was great value into them. And we can talk about endorsements too. We did endorsements. That's probably a whole other hour-long conversation. But we had unsigned editorial endorsements, and getting people to understand how those came about. I talked myself blue in the face, or whatever the equivalent is in terms of writing columns to explain how we wrote our things, and people still didn't quite get it. So I've kind of come around to the fact I don't use the term op-ed. I call them guest essays or commentaries if they're from the public, and columns signed by the certain writer if they're from a staff member. During election season, we still do have an editorial board, and I try to explain what that is, but editorial board is also one of those terms of art that a lot of journalists don't entirely understand. So I think I've come around, it's a great question, and I've come around, Bill, to trying to just explain to folks in plain English what we do. And to your point, talking to the generation of kids. I go into colleges all the time, and I try to explain what we do. And this isn't important only in opinion journalism. Kevin earlier was talking about news deserts and the proliferation of news deserts. The way to stop having news deserts and to push back on them is to get people to understand why journalism is important in the first place. And that also is something that historically, over decades, journalists have done poorly. We've relied on others to do that, and you can see where we are. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to in any way we can, whether it's talking to neighbors, folks at church, people in the community, at Little League games of our kids, to ask them about news, understand how they get their news, and to maybe suggest better ways that they can, and then be better at the work ourselves.
Bill, this is an issue that it's a terrific question, because it's an issue that I care about and think about a lot. I've thought for many years that there should be media literacy courses in early as high school, and that's all the more critical now because there's such a flow of information coming at people. As with Matt, every election I will do a column explaining our endorsement process and how we come up with those and who makes the decision. Ultimately, I would be accountable for it, but it wasn't just my opinion. And I think that was very important. But Matt is exactly right. We do not. This is an area that I think journalism, newspapers specifically, have really failed over time. A lot of people think of now, they almost think like back at the turn of the 20th century when you had clearly ideological newspapers where people think this is a Republican paper, a Democratic paper, so I really either can believe everything they say or not believe or anything that's in there. I think we need to do a much better job. It's an area where we really faltered, even within our own pages. And as Matt says, even within the newsroom, I will have people come up to me, even though we've written in the paper about how we come up with editorial positions and endorsements. People will say, well, how did you come up with that? Was that the publisher coming down the hall, or who on the board was really the influential person? I think we just need to do so much more transparency and accountability on that. And also, I really think as a society, this is so important that it really ought to be a required course as early as high school.
Thank you both. And we do have Yvette Walker with us tonight. I'll just say a word about her. She's the Kansas City Star's opinion editor, and she leads its editorial board. She's also the founder and director and CEO of Positively Joy Ministries, LLC. Hello, Yvette. Yvette, we'll just start with you and telling us a little bit about your role and what are you seeing as far as opinion pieces And Yvette, also, I'm not seeing you on the screen, so I'm not sure about your camera, but just wanted to mention that.
Hello, I think I came in as just a viewer somehow. I'm not quite sure if there was another link I was supposed to come in. I apologize. I was at work. No excuse. But before I get to your question, I would love just to briefly talk about what John was just talking about and Bill. So, Bill, first of all, I'm sure you didn't throw in that question as a ringer, but Bill and I spoke at 8 different churches last year about um, opinion writing and about politics and about how we can help the public get the information they need to live to make the decisions that they have to make in their daily lives. And that was very eye-opening. It was great. It was a wonderful opportunity. It was a lot, 8 different sessions. But that was something that we did and was something I thought that was important. And then John was just talking about media literacy, very important. I taught media literacy in and then also I just spoke to a high school teacher who I raised my hand and said, "Hey, I'd love to talk to students. Perhaps I can come." And he says, "We were talking about media literacy." I'm like, "Put me down. I love talking about media literacy." So that is important. And at least at one high school here in the Kansas City area, they are doing that. So I just wanted to just briefly say that. Okay, I'm sorry. One more time, ask your question.
I just wondered if you could tell us just a little bit what you do in your role and what you're seeing as far as opinion pieces.
Absolutely. So we do have an editorial board. It is smaller than the one that Matt used to work on. And we certainly do have unsigned editorials. But we have a pretty active community that loves to write columns for us. We still do call them op-eds, but I completely understand how that can be a confusing term. So we're seeing a variety of people write about politics, of course, but there's a lot of issues going on in our states, because we're on the border of Kansas and Missouri right now, and that have people, kind of, really concerned about things. One, for example, is the voter initiatives. Voters will pass something, and then the legislature wants to come back and undo what they did. And so that is a topic that is certainly politics related, but it talks about the issues that the voters voted for, such as sick leave and various things like that. So we will hear from a lot of readers on that. So, I mean, I'm happy to say that our community is pretty active, but we're always trying to, whenever I talk to anybody, I encourage them and I invite them to write. I'm like, you can write for us. We are happy, to work with you. We would love to hear from you. And that way, we're hoping to get a more varied group. We are getting some young people writing for us. For some reason, we're beginning to see teenagers, send in columns, which I love. And they are talking about a variety of things. Sometimes they talk about why it's important to listen to young people, but a lot of times they will tackle issues. So I think we're seeing a variety of things here in the Kansas City area.
Thank you, Yvette, and thanks for being with us tonight. Great to hear from you.
Thank you. Sorry I was late.
We have a listener question or a viewer question from Margie. She says, you speak about fact-based editorials and columns. What are you doing on a regular basis to address the disinformation disseminated by social media, and how are you dealing with the problems that is social media? How are you dealing with the problem that is social media where most young people get their news? Matt, I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I'll be honest, I was addicted to social media a couple of years, as recently as a couple of years ago. I was an early adopter of Twitter and I loved it. My young daughter, who's a high school senior, would bring the phone to me when my notifications pinged and said, "Daddy, Twitter's calling." And first thing I did in the morning, grab my phone. First thing I did going to bed, also in the morning, grab my phone. You know, journalists, we don't sleep. So I come at this from a place of a person who was addicted to social media and loved it and found great utility there, even though it also could be toxic and sexist and terrible. And now I just think it's mostly toxic and sexist and terrible. And so I don't go on X anymore. I've tried to use Blue Sky a little bit, and I still use Facebook. But the reality is I don't use TikTok as much as everyone else on the planet does. And that's where a lot of young kids, particularly people under 30, go to get their quote unquote news. I still think we need to meet people where they're at. And I think we need to very seriously take our roles as fact finders and fact sharers. But there's a difficult task there in terms of like the truth sandwich, right? Where we take the lie and we surround it by two pieces of bread that are fact based. People still grab hold of that lie, whether it's on social media or in a 800-word column, and that's what they walk away with. It's very difficult in a headline, which is so important both on social media and in conventional press, to tackle these complex issues, especially when we're talking about truth versus fact versus truthiness. So I think you've seized on it's a great question, and I really don't have the answers. I'm very curious to hear what Yvette and John have to say. I have, not that I've given up on it, but I think that this is another problem with journalism. We gave away the store, right? Online websites were free from the very beginning. We thought that Google and Facebook would save us and they'd surface all our stuff. And all of a sudden, Google could care less about our links and Facebook could care less about our video. So I think it's increasingly incumbent. And this gets back to Bill's question. I love that, Yvette, you talked about how you and Bill were in 8 churches, because that's what we need to do as journalists. It's not individual conversations with individual readers that are going to save this industry, but it's building a community which builds trust as it builds audience. And those kinds of sessions in church groups and libraries and public meetings, that's how you kind of keep the distance of social media while building real connections and real community. That's my thought. It's kind of complicated. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
No, and that kind of adds into really what sparked this panel tonight. Kevin brought up the idea of today's media landscape and how that's changed opinion writing. And I think it, as you said, Matt, the social media and some of the different things that have come into play have really impacted it. So John or Yvette, do you have anything to add there as far as either social media or just the media landscape today, and how do we navigate that?
Well, I don't think there's a universal solution. Go ahead, Yvette. I'll
No,
come
no,
after
no,
you.
go. You go right ahead.
I was going to say, I don't think there's a universal solution to how to combat this fire hose of information that includes a lot of conspiracies, a lot of fabrications, and in some cases even AI produced material. But I think what we can do as journalists, when we see a conspiracy or misinformation that's getting out there, we can address that issue, especially if it becomes very prevalent. I remember there was a day when back when I used to be frustrated when someone would tell me something I knew was questionable, and I would say, "Well, where did you see that?" And they say, "Well, I read it in the newspaper." I go, "Well, what newspaper?" And a lot of times they didn't know. Now it's even broader. Somebody will say something outlandish and say, and I'll say, "Well, where did you see that?" And they said, "Well, I saw it on the internet." So it's certainly a huge issue, and I think all the main thing that we can do to combat it is, as I mentioned earlier, with our transparency, our commitment to accountability, make that very plain to readers so that that they can see that we're a trusted source.
I totally agree. I'm one of those friends, Facebook friends or whatever. I'm one of those folks that will tell people, no, this is wrong, and provide a link to Snopes or something. I'm one of those people. But I've even gotten caught up in that. Sometimes you're moving so fast and you see something and you want to share it and you realize, no, that person's been been dead for 3 years now. So we can even get caught up in that. No, I agree. I think that I think it is important for us to provide as much transparency as we can. I don't always want to talk about politics, but this is just an example. So we had primaries here, and we have one of our larger cities that had a lot going on, and we decided to really dig down into what was going on in Wyandotte County, Kansas City, Kansas. And before we began the endorsements in the primary, I wrote an article saying, this is why we're taking a look at Wyandotte. Why there's a lot going on in Wyandotte. This is what you need to know. Is the stadium might be coming here. Maybe it's not. There's other things happening, data centers, blah, blah, blah. And this is why Wyandotte, we need to focus on Wyandotte now. And so I wrote that column before the endorsements started rolling out. And I hope that was helpful to people to understand why we were indeed, covering the Wyandotte primaries as hard as we did. And I think we should do that every chance we get. Every chance we get to tell people why we're doing what we're doing. And I think that we, unlike news, we have the ability and opportunity to do that in our columns. Because we can be more conversational. We can say exactly what we think and why we're doing something. And I think that sometimes we need to do that more. As far as social media, so I am similar to Matt. So I'm not on X anymore. I have a Blue Sky account. I'm not really active there. I am very active on Facebook and Instagram. As soon as my phone figures some things out, I'll be back on TikTok. I have an older phone. I'm waiting for the new Apple to come out so I can buy the previous version because the price will go down. And it's actually, my phone doesn't like playing with TikTok very much, but I do think it's important to be where people are. And I also take a look at what my audience, so the audience/growth department at our company, so where is the star? The star is on TikTok, the star is on Facebook, the star is on a few different places, but the star is not on some places. So I'm not where the star isn't. And I think it's important to share and to look at where we're focusing on as a company. The folks in our audience and growth teams are brilliant. They know a whole lot more than I do. And so I get to learn from them and see, okay, so where's our focus and where do we think our readers are? And so that's not, that's not the only thing that I do, but I see myself doing that a little bit more as I have the opportunities to learn from some smart people in the room.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm going to shift here a little bit for a minute. A lot of our attendees tonight are column writers and editorial writers. And I just wondered if you had a big piece of advice that you would offer to other writers. Maybe that's on your experience and what you've seen. Maybe that's just something like a way we can do a better job at our jobs. Yvette, I'll start with you on this one.
Okay. Well, I would say that, it's interesting because when we're considering what we're going to do, passion drives a lot of it. Let's just say passion and interest drives a lot of it. And that is important. Obviously, sometimes we have to write about things that we perhaps, don't know as much about or not that interested in. But when we have an opportunity to write about something that's important to our readership area and that we have a kind of personal passion or some kind of background, it comes out in the column. I'm thinking of, so this was a lighter thing, but one of our writers, and I don't know if Toriano Porter is on the call today, but Toriano is at the Kansas City Star. He grew up in St. Louis, and and I'm sorry, I'm not going to get the name right, so I'm not going to say it, but one of the Chiefs players, which just did a preseason game, was coming home after the game, and his wife made him kimchi spam fried rice. So they are from the Pacific area, and spam's a big deal there. So Toriano, who also grew up eating spam. This, you know, this kind of touched him, and he talked about this funny idea of this Chiefs player's wife who'd come out on she'd come out on social media, and she talked about it. So people were talking about it, and how she'd made this kimchi fried rice. And so it was just more of a little divert me type thing. But, you know, he was able to pull in his personality and the fact that he'd eaten spam growing up. And by the way, I did too. I don't eat it anymore. So it was fun. Now that's a light thing. And I get that. That's not, you know, maybe the most important story in the world, but it was an opportunity to talk about an issue where he had direct knowledge, maybe not the kimchi fried rice portion of it, but just, you know, able to connect it. And readers, you know, I think readers really enjoy that. Now, I will say this, on the more serious note, a grocery store just closed in what will now become, again, a food desert. It was a grocery store in the east side of Kansas City that the city had poured a lot of money into, and lots of stuff happened. It's a perfect storm of things that went wrong, but it has closed. And so I'm writing a piece on that, and I'm writing a piece from the perspective of it is important to have a full service, good grocery store in your community, in your neighborhood. And I talk about growing up on the south side of Chicago and remembering that, yes, we would drive 45 minutes to go to the good store in white neighborhoods. Yes, that happened. But it was important for us to have a full service grocery store in our neighborhood that maybe wasn't great. Maybe the produce and the meats were always almost on the way out, but it was important to have it there. And so I'm going to use that to talk about this very important issue, and what's going to happen now with this community that's no longer going to have a grocery store. So, you know, you don't always have to pull yourself into it, and there's many times you shouldn't. But often if you can, or if you have, I find that if you have a connection that you can show, the readers seem to, I guess, enjoy learning maybe more about you and understanding the connection. That's just one little thing. And it's certainly not going to happen for every story, and I get that. But if there's an opportunity, why not?
I would have a couple of points of advice for an aspiring opinion writer. One, find a niche. Look for something that is important, but other media is not really focused on. I think back at the San Francisco Chronicle when we did an editorial campaign on foster care. There were 80,000 foster kids in California, and you know they were underfunded. The caseloads were just ridiculous. And it was so intertwined with all the other issues that we were writing about. Homelessness, the percentage of homeless people who had been in foster care, the prison system, a staggering number of California inmates had been formerly in foster care, and the education failures, the idea that, you know, a foster kid was several times, you know, more likely to end up in prison than to graduate from college. So that really gave us a lane, if you will, that we could hammer, and that people paid attention to us, including the governor at the time, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who then became an advocate for some of those reforms. So I would say find a niche would be one point I would make, and I think this is expanding on what Yvette says, is no matter how serious you are, and of course for opinion writers, we want to be serious unless, you know, you're Dave Barry or something, but show a little of yourself, break from the seriousness now and then to show yourself being human, whether you're writing about your role as a father, as a dog owner, or something in the community that touches you. I think that's really important, because the feedback I would get, you know, when I would particularly writing a personal column, with people go, well, gee, you know, I just thought, you know, you were, you know, up there in the ivory tower. I think that's really important to establish not only your credibility, but your humanity with readers.
That's super good.
Yeah, that is.
That's really good. And I guess I would just add, I mean, Yvette and John offered some great advice. I would just think what really unlocked opinion journalism for me years ago was the realization that you don't have to do it all in a day and then forget about it for months or a year and return to the same subject. That in fact, the way to build a readership is to return to these same issues. And as I said, I'm not looking to shut down a conversation or end a conversation, but to keep it going. So you can follow up on a subject the next day if you choose. You get a nice email from a reader or someone who raises something in a critical or thoughtful way and makes you revisit the issue. Too often I think opinion sections are, here's a column, here's another column. You can have an opinion page that has 3 perspectives on the same topic. And in fact, maybe you should be pairing people who disagree with you, have their ideas, column letters run alongside yours so that, again, people see varying perspectives. I think too often now people think of journalism as siloed, as MSNBC or Fox, and that's only where they turn for their information. The way to kind of crack that line of thinking is to incorporate multiple perspectives in your outlet, whether that's in your specific column or in your pages, if you're fortunate enough to be an editor and not simply the writer. So I think that multitude of viewpoints can go a long way. And that can be different pieces of writing on the same subject, or you tackling the same subject through multiple ways that are, of course, interesting. Yvette talked about analytics, and we don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but yes, you should be looking at those and thinking of ways, if your story's misfired, whether it was the wrong framing or the wrong headline, or maybe it's the wrong subject and your readers simply don't care about it. So there's other things to write about.
Thank you all. This is great. Kevin, did
Hey,
you
Jenny.
want to chime in?
Yeah, I would say the one piece of advice that I always took and I would share with my staff when it came to writing columns is that don't be predictable. When they open up the paper and they see your column sig, and I want them to be surprised about what they're going to read. So we had a columnist who regularly wrote about her family, and she wrote good columns, but everyone sort of knew when they opened up the page and saw her that she was going to be writing about her family. I always wondered, my whole thing was, don't be predictable. Am I going to be writing about my family? Am I going to be writing about city council? Am I going to be writing about a national issue? Am I going to write something that's completely wacky and irrelevant to most people? But at least I drew their attention and a lot of times drew them into that. So that's what I would say first and foremost when you're a columnist. Don't be predictable. When people see your face in a paper, don't let them associate it with a specific talk.
And don't turn your family into the Kardashians, right?
Well, my sons were, a few times I wrote about my sons, and then, the teachers or someone would say something in school, and I was fortunate. Actually was a managing editor of my hometown newspaper for a while. So anyway, it came with the good parts and the bad parts. Oh, real quick, and I don't want to. I'm happy to share this with anybody who wants to once I figure out how to just. Back in the day, when I say back in the 1990s, if you went to an SPJ convention, they would tape record all of the sessions, and then they would put them on cassettes, and then you could buy this library of cassettes if you wanted to listen to, 10 cassettes in a package or whatever. But there is one, I just found it last year, and I don't have a cassette player. It's called Playing God, The Art of Opinion Writing. And I have yet to listen to that. I didn't attend it. So at least back in the 90s, it was perceived as being godly when you shared your opinion on the editorial pages.
It'd be really interesting to hear now.
If I can get a player and I can translate it or whatever, I'll be sure to send it to all of you.
Thanks. We just have a few minutes left of our time together tonight. We do have a couple audience member questions. Francis asks, how do you ethically keep your opinion essays separate from your journalist quote unquote objectivity? John, why don't you start with that one?
Well, I think I'm not sure that objectivity necessarily is the word that you would apply to opinion writing, because you are taking a position. I think fairness is more important. That you're fair to the other side, even if you're kind of mocking it a bit, but at the same time presenting it fairly and not putting words in somebody's mouth, not putting motivations on somebody's position. So I think fairness is important, and I keep that in mind. And I really thought, as an editorial writer and a columnist, that it was very important for me to develop sources of my own, and working sources as if I were a beat reporter in areas that I was interested in. And in order to do that, you really do have to be fair, or the other side is not going to be returning your calls. But if they see you've been treated fairly, then I think you've achieved that mission.
Yvette or Matt, would you like to add anything to that?
I'll just say that I think because we do give perspectives, we do have opinions, we can make people mad. So if we have sources that we need to speak to, perhaps unlike a news reporter, they may say, well, I know how you feel about me, or I know where you come down on me, so I don't want to talk to you. So what I think we have to do is to feel free to give our opinions, but it must be based on what I think we would call fact-based journalism. But we do give our opinions. I definitely think John is correct in being fair, but sometimes that can work against us because we have, given commentary about a source or a company or whatever what's going on. And that can be difficult when we want to talk to them and get their side of the story. So that's something I think we just, continue to work with, but we have to, that's our job. It's our job to give perspectives and to help people understand, what's going on in their area. But I do think that what we do has to be based on, what you might call fact-based journalism. But objectivity, if you're going to say objectivity, I guess perhaps you can say you want to be, I was going to say objective to the truth, but I don't even think really that works. I just think that we do have to be fair, and we have to make sure that we have the facts that back up the perspectives that we give.
And then you approach issues open-minded, even if you think you know where you're going to go. Be willing to take in information that might challenge your opinion, especially when in California, where there's too much democracy at election time, especially in San Francisco. You have all these ballot measures, and I may at the beginning know where I think I'm going to be headed, but the meetings, my research can change my mind. I think that's healthy.
Francis wanted to clarify, your day job is regular journalism. So I don't know if that might kind of weigh in a little bit on it. Margie asked, to what extent are you writing about assaults on the First Amendment, and how are you framing the idea that you and your team are important resources for your communities? Great question. Matt, why don't you take it away here?
Oh, it looks like
where Matt lost his connection temporarily.
Yeah.
Yvette, why don't you start with that one then?
Sure. So
the First Amendment.
Mm-hmm. So I love the First Amendment. I think writing about the First Amendment in a way that keeps readers' interest is challenging. But something happened here in Kansas that you may recall, where police raided a newsroom, and the co-owners, there was an older woman mother of the publisher, but she was co-owner of the paper. The police went to her house, kind of manhandled her just a little bit. Anyway, she died the next day. So when we covered, whether or not, and the reason why they raided in the first place, it's complicated, but so we talked about that. A lot had happened, of course, but the bottom line was the paper, the Marion County Record, had the right to do what they were doing, and the police had no business, and the judge had no business giving the police the warrant to come in and raid. And so anyway, that was a big piece. We did many stories, and I hope that we were able to write these stories in a way, and I think that we were, that helped the reader understand why this is important. So what we don't want to do in writing about the First Amendment is go navel gazing, or navel, whatever that term is, and lose them. Oh, well, so what? Why is that important? So I think it's important that we help them, show them why it's important, and it's something that we should do really on the regular.
Yeah, I certainly wrote a lot of editorials as an advocate for the First Amendment, whether it turns out to be access to public records. We also had a lot of issues with access to fundraisers, and just up and down the line. And even where really being a First Amendment advocate gets really tough is when you're deciding which pieces to put in the paper, when there's an opinion that you're really not comfortable with. Somebody, it's not only that do you disagree with it, but you kind of feel like it's unduly provocative. You have to remind yourself the First Amendment goes both ways. It's not just for those who print, buy ink by the barrel, or have a website with a lot of views.
That's great. Kevin, you had something to add?
No, I think I summed it up really well. Yeah, I think we're in a situation, and we have been for a while, where, we've never been a popular profession in society. And I think that we have done a number of different things that shoots ourselves in the foot. Sometimes it seems like on a daily basis. But we are important. I mean, we're important for the existence of democracy. We're important and I think a lot of people lose sight of that. And it's something that we need to be reminding people of. We don't have to shove it in their face, but I think that unless they're a politician, in which case we may need to more actively suggest to them that that we still have rights. But no, I think John and Yvette touched on it perfectly. So thanks for their comments.
Thanks to all of you. Wow, what a wonderful conversation tonight. I'm going to close it out with just one more question. How do you feel like opinion pieces have helped shape a more informed and democratic society? And then just if you have any closing thoughts to share with our guests, that's kind of a big question, but how have you seen opinion pieces, more shape and inform society?
Go ahead, Beth.
Sure. So I'm always pleased when I get an email from perhaps a regular naysayer write to me and say in not so many words, okay, thank you, I'm going to think about what you said, instead of just being, a naysayer. Occasionally that happens. It is gratifying, certainly gratifying. Like, okay, I perhaps changed a mind here. Or at least, this person's willing to think about a point of view that I know that he disagrees with, because he tells me this all the time. So, I mean, that makes our day, of course, as opinion writers, when we know this. And the fact that people still write in and respond, not necessarily commenting on the story, but who will write you an email and will tell you, thank you, or yes, this happened to me, or I'm so glad that you tackled this, or I was confused about this. Thanks for writing that. And if one person writes you, there's thousands more who probably feel the same way, but they're not gonna sit down at the computer and do it. But I think even if we don't get responses like that, I think we have to know ourselves that it's such an important job that we have. It's an important job that we do. And as I've always described this, what we do is helping people understand and make decisions around themselves to live their lives in the best way possible. That's how I describe what we do. And so I think it's an important job and one I'm happy to have.
Here's a tip for opinion writers. If you're trying to figure out how to amplify your impact, it took me a couple of years as editorial page editor to figure this out. But when people are reading a piece that you've written and they feel very strongly that you're on the right side, the question in their mind is, tell me what I can do about it. So I would list the names of the legislators who were involved. Here's their email address. Here's the timing of the next hearing. If they hear from you, it's much more likely that they're going to respond than just don't write to me, write to them. And it really had an impact when we did actually a 3-year editorial campaign for a financial privacy law in California. And when it finally passed, and I was there on the floor of the state legislature watching it pass after this real struggle, because the financial service industry was spending $20 million lobbying California's 100 legislators. Member after member came up to me, and none of them said, hey, it was because you're such a great writer, you're such a great thinker, it's because of the power of the Chronicle. They said, no, your editorials caused the public to rain hell on us with emails, and that had a real impact. And ultimately it got, at that time, Governor Gray Davis, who had been hedging back and forth, trying to play both sides of the fence. He finally came around. So please tell readers what they can do and how they can do it.
What great
Jenny-
information. Thank you again to all of you. Thank you to the Kiplinger program for sponsoring us tonight. Thank you to our panelists for taking the time to really share some insight and expertise on this topic. And I know all of our panelists, as I mentioned at the beginning, are really leaders in the field. So I'm sure any of them, if you had a question that maybe didn't get answered tonight, they'd love to hear from you. So feel free to reach out to me or to them directly. I'm sure they'd be glad to talk with you more or make that connection. So thank you to everyone, and thanks for being here tonight. We will have this recording available if you had to step away or if you want to share it with a friend. So thank you again to everyone. Thank you to Matt. Thank you to John, Kevin, and Yvette. They're great leaders, as I said, in the field. And thanks also to our attendees and NSNC members tonight. Have a great night, everyone. I'm going to conclude the recording.
Thank you.